Thank you, Dr. Olson. And next, Dr. John Lott, President of the Crime Prevention Research Center.
Good morning. Good morning, Your Honor.
Welcome, sir, and begin if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is John Lott. I'm president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. I want to thank Chairman Cornish, Ranking Member Hillstrom, Representative Nash, who invited me, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss stand your ground laws. These laws basically help the most vulnerable people in our society to be able to defend themselves. The people who use them the most are the people most likely to be victims of violent crime. That overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. There are 33 states that have stand your ground type rules. Most of them are through legislation, though 6 of them have been through court decisions. And in fact, you have some places in the United States that have stand your ground rules for over 150 years. The support up until the last few years has been overwhelmingly bipartisan. You can find a number of states, in fact 12 states, where at least one of the bodies of the legislature have passed these rules unanimously. The last few years, though, there's been more of a debate on this, and they've largely stemmed from incidents in Florida involving Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis. The irony is that in the Trayvon Martin case, the stand your ground rules were not relevant. The notion that somebody should retreat as far as possible. As was just mentioned earlier, if a person initiates the fight that occurs, they can't then go and claim stand your ground type protections. So you have 2 possible interpretations in the Trayvon Martin case. Either Trayvon Martin had George Zimmerman pinned to the ground and there was no place for him to retreat, or the other alternative is somehow George Zimmerman initiated the attack. In that case, you also wouldn't have been able to use stand your ground as a defense. In the Jordan Davis case, somebody tried to use stand your ground, but in fact he was still convicted of firing the gun. And the theater shooting that people have talked about is in court right now, but we could talk about that. So I'm not going to go and talk about the main points of the law other than what I mentioned with initiation. But claims of racism with regard to stand your ground basically have it backwards. Again, the groups that are disproportionately victims of violent crime are the ones most likely to rely on stand your ground. Florida has the most detailed data on this. Blacks make about 16.7% of the Florida population, but they account for 34% of the state's defendants invoking stand your ground rules. Black defendants who invoke this statute are also more likely to be acquitted than whites by about 4 percentage points. The data that's been collected goes from 2006, January 2006, when the stand your ground law went into effect, through the end of 2014. There were 119 cases. The claim of racism using this often looks at the fact that 67% of those who killed a black person faced no penalty, compared to 57% of those who killed a white person. The problem that this ignores is that murders almost always involve people of the same race. 80% of the people who killed blacks involving stand your ground cases were themselves black. About 80% of those who killed whites were white. And when you take that into account, you realize that if you want to go and declare racism based on who's most likely to be acquitted, who kills a black, you have to realize it's primarily blacks who are using that defense in having killed a black in self-defense. And so you get 64% of blacks who raised stand your ground defense were not convicted, compared to 60% of whites. The cases are not similar in other ways also. Blacks killed in confrontations involving stand your ground cases were 26% more likely to be armed than whites. By a 25 percentage point margin, the blacks killed were also more likely to be involved in the process of committing a crime. And they were also slightly more likely to have witnesses present when the attack occurred. And when you run statistical tests that account for all these different factors at the same time, what you essentially find is that white defendants are more likely in stand your ground cases to be convicted. People invoking stand your ground laws who killed blacks were also more likely to be convicted than people who killed whites. And as one would hope, whether the person killed initiated the confrontation and whether there was an eyewitness were by far the most important factors for determining whether or not there was a conviction. I just briefly mentioned something, well, I guess I'll just go on to other research. There's a number of studies that have been done linking stand your ground laws to murder or homicide rates. There are about equal numbers of studies on both sides. Slightly more find a benefit than find a bad effect. But there are a couple things to point out here. The ones that find the benefit all look at national data, basically look at it for all the years that the data is available. The ones that find that there's been a bad effect either look at just one state, in the case of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and for a limited number of years, starting in 1999, or they look at only a very narrow period of time, and I'll get into that. In the research that I published in the University of Chicago Press and other papers by Carl Moody and others, in my case, I look at data from 1977 through 2012. What I find is that after you have stand your ground rules go into effect, murder rates fall on average by about 1.5 percentage points per year annually during the first 10 years that those laws are in effect. The JAMA study, which was alluded to earlier in the public comments on the previous bill, finds that there is an increase in homicides from about 5.9 per 100,000 to about 6.3 per 100,000 before and after the law goes into effect. That's about a 6.9% increase. But the thing is, they only look at one state, and they don't control for any other factors. So, for example, one factor that one may want to take into account is that between 2005 and 2006, there was a huge drop in arrests for murder in Florida. The arrest rate for murders in Florida fell from 82.4% in 2005 to 66.9% in 2006. So while you had a 6.9% increase in homicides, at the same time you had a 19% drop in the arrest rate for murders. And also one should point out that this study is looking at homicides rather than murders. And I'm not sure most people understand that there's a distinction between homicides and murders. The big difference is whether or not you have justifiable homicides involved, whether it be by police or be by civilians. And I think it's a mistake then to go and look at homicides rather than murders when you're looking at this, because you have to ask yourself if there are more justifiable homicides that occurred, and that's partly what's driving the difference between looking at homicides and murders. If somebody's protecting themselves from a crime or a police officer is being threatened, I'm not sure that that's bad in the same way that a drop in murders would be significant. The other study was by Texas A&M. They only looked at laws adopted between 2005 and 2010. They ignored states that had these rules imposed by court action.
Dr. Lott, you could keep going, but I just want to let you know that we've got about 5 minutes and 2 people behind you to go into that.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I can, anyway, you know, the important thing is they didn't look at anything after 2010. Again, you have this difference between homicides and murders. And, you know, again, there's questions about not being controlled. So why somebody would throw out all the data and all the laws prior to 2005 isn't really obvious. My general rule is that if somebody throws out data, they better have a good reason for throwing it out. And so you have, in any case, the data is divided on this question. But I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor.